This is Windows 3.1, a thoroughly 16-bit shell running on top of Microsoft's MS-DOS operating system, and this was released in 1992. This is Windows 95, a whole new 32-bit operating system with its own overhauled version of DOS fully integrated, and this was released in 1995. As you can see, they're very different indeed, but how did Microsoft make it from point A to point B in 3 very short years? Well, in this video, I'm going to show you with the help of some leaked pre-release builds of Windows 95. And to facilitate this, we're going to need a period-correct PC. And what better PC than my 486 DX4100 here from 1994, so smack bang in the middle of that development cycle. And the cool thing about this PC is that it has a compact flash card slot. So instead of a hard drive, I have installed various development builds of Windows 95 onto these compact flash cards, and we're going to work through them in this video and chart the development of this very historically important OS right before our very eyes. But before we go back to the beginning, let's start at, well, the end goal, the actual release of Windows 95 and the huge legendary party that Microsoft put on in their home of Redmond, Washington, hosted by Microsoft CEO Bill Gates and none other than US talk show host Jay Leno. Now, I think it's fair to say that this event was a huge deal for Microsoft, and quite rightly so, because Windows 95 itself was a huge deal, of course. A complete reinvention of their user interface paradigm and throwing away the old ancient MS-DOS underpinnings of the past, at least superficially so anyway, and that's something that we will get into a little bit later on in the video. But there was a whole range of Windows 95 branded merch to go along with this launch. So t-shirts and even Windows 95 beer and baseball caps, VHS tapes starring the cast of Friends, no less. I mean, it was very much a 90s affair. And this was all set to the soundtrack of the Rolling Stones' iconic track, Start Me Up, which of course was a reference to the brand new Start menu user interface. An interface that has stood the test of time and still survives today in Windows 11, despite Microsoft's best efforts to kill it off. Of course, to get to this point, Microsoft had to develop the operating system in the first place, and that's a process that started way back in 1992, before the release of Windows 95's predecessor, Windows 3.1. Now, unfortunately, the beginnings of the Windows 95 project aren't really that well publicly documented, but what we do know is that the OS started life as 3 different internal projects, with the codenames Cougar, Panther and Jaguar. Now, one of these projects was to develop a follow-up to the highly successful MS-DOS 6.22. MS-DOS 7 indeed, which would become the foundation for Windows 95. Another of these projects was to create a brand new Windows shell, a replacement for Windows 3.1's Program Manager. And so Microsoft decided to bring it all together under one codename, Chicago. The Chicago project was not only the biggest development project at Microsoft to date, but also, interestingly, the most open, with Microsoft deciding to involve around 400,000 beta testers over the course of the operating system's development. And that is how we managed to get our hands on these leaked releases today. Now, they did actually try to add some protection over the course of the OS's development, but as you might imagine, that has been reverse engineered and cracked, and of course we will also show how that works a little bit later on in this video. So now you're up to speed on the story behind Windows 95's development and launch, I think it's about time we checked out the first known build from July 1992. And here it is, build 07200022, a rather catchy name, and indeed the only known build of Chicago that uses that naming convention. And as you can probably see, this very much looks like Windows 3.1. It uses the Windows 3.1 installer, pretty much completely unmodified, and the name Chicago doesn't actually appear anywhere on this. So you might be thinking, well, hang on a second, how is this part of the Chicago family? I mean, it even predates the official spec for Chicago by 2 whole months, so surely surely it can't be part of that lineage. But there are actually some quite interesting things to check out in this build, and it is kind of part of the development story of Windows 95. So I wanted to show it to you today. If we go into Help and About, we can see the version number here, which of course is 3.1, and you saw during startup that it does still use the original 3.1 startup screen and everything else. But there are some quite obvious modifications here if you are familiar with the Windows 3.1 Program Manager. For example, this has this kind of 3D look about it, which I suppose is quite interesting. And as you probably also saw during startup, this is quite broken, quite a few errors and things. And it's designed to be run on top of Cougar, and unfortunately we don't have access to that. So the DOS support is completely broken in this specific build, so we can't run any DOS applications. The 32-bit Windows support is basically non-existent. They had kind of made a start on it, but it isn't really supported at all, so we can't run any 32-bit Windows applications either. Very much a broken build of Windows, this, as you might expect from a very early kind of pre-alpha build, and that's one of the things that kind of excites me about it as well. Now, what we do have that is quite interesting are some new applications that are actually exclusive to this build and kind of show some interesting dead ends that Microsoft was exploring at the time. So I think these are well worth taking a look at. And the first one that I want to show to you is called drag and drop printing. Now, I don't have a printer connected to this machine, and apparently this doesn't really work properly anyway, but this is a really interesting concept. So you have this icon on your desktop called drag and drop printing, and if you want to print a document or an image or something like that, you literally just drag and drop it straight onto the icon. I thought it was very interesting indeed, very interesting concept. Unfortunately, we can't try it out on this particular build, but just thought I would make you aware of it. And unfortunately, the next thing that I want to show to you is also broken, but I do have some working things for you that we will take a look at in a minute, I promise. But this is the Windows Memory Viewer, or Heaps Viewer. Now, this apparently can be patched to make it work, but unfortunately, I haven't managed to get it working for this video. But it does give me a great opportunity to shout out betawiki.net, which is the source that I used for most of the research for this video. And they do have some screenshots of this working, and I think it is a very interesting looking application. And again, something that ended up being a bit of a dead end for Microsoft as well. So a very interesting piece of history. And indeed, if you want to check out any of the articles on these builds, the links to the beta wiki pages will be down in the description as well. So you can check out some of the kind of more in-depth technical information that I won't be going into in this video. Next up, we have something that is actually working, and this is the raster bitmap editor. Now, you might think that this looks very familiar. It looks very similar to Paintbrush, of course, which was the Paint package in Windows 3.1, went on to become Microsoft Paint in Windows 95 onwards. But it's ever so slightly different. Evidently, they've been doing some work on this to try to kind of upgrade and improve the user interface. Quite a bit here that's not working, as you might expect. And as you can see, it's a bit of an oddball, this, but evidently something that they were experimenting with. And finally, the last thing that I want to show to you from this build, just before we move on, is the Windows Item Manager. Now, this icon might look quite familiar to you. If you know Windows 3.1, of course, it's the Program Manager icon, the actual user interface that Windows 3.1 uses. And indeed, this is very similar in concept and even supports the same group files. So we can go in here and we can open the accessories group, for example, and we have all of our accessories in here. And I think the concept behind this was that essentially you could create groups for projects that you were working on. So if you used the same kind of 3 or 4 applications on a specific project, you could create a group for it and have it all available in one place in the Windows Project Manager. But again, this ended up being a bit of a dead end and not something that we will see in any of the builds that we're looking at today. Just another interesting quirk of build 07200022 from July 1992. Okay, so August 1993 now, and this is build 58S, and as we can see, this is very much starting to resemble Windows 95 by this point. So still branded as Chicago, and we do have this wonderful pre-release message that comes up on screen here, but we have something at least starting to resemble a start menu. But first, before we start looking at the actual desktop, let's check out the installer, because this is quite interesting and some progress has been made here. Now, as you can see in the installer, they have gone with the Chicago branding by this point, and we will be installing into the C:/Chicago folder as well. Now, this installer is still based on the Windows 3.1 installer, and I must say, a few of the versions of 58S that I found online don't actually include this. They do include an installer, and it's a massive pain to get working. So if you want to download any of these builds and check them out for yourself, please do use the archive.org links down in the description, rather than some of the other builds that are floating around on the internet, because these are the ones that I have used in this video, and I can at least say that they are working, or at least to the extent that I've shown in this video. But yeah, wonderful Chicago branded installer, and we will be seeing the evolution of this, of course, throughout this video. But if we go back to the desktop here, perhaps the most obvious thing, other than this rather in-your-face under construction wallpaper, is that we have these two applications running here. So Microsoft hadn't actually decided on showing the running applications in the taskbar like they did in the eventual RTM, or release to manufacturing release of Windows 95. And we have something running here called the tracker, and this basically tracks what's happening on the system, and you can generate bug reports and things and send them back to Microsoft, of course, as part of the testing program. And we also have Dr. Watson, which is kind of a very similar concept. It's a debugger, and it's kind of set up to try to catch errors and things and generate reports, of course, to send back to Microsoft, as that's very useful feedback for them while they are, of course, working on Windows Chicago. A few other interesting technical details of note, I guess. We do have the boot screen in here now, so they've already moved away from that Windows 3.1 boot screen. It only flashes up very quickly on this machine, but this does use the logo .sys, so it actually works the same way as the final release to manufacturing release. And it also has DOS 7 bundled with it, which of course itself is also still under development at this point, but doesn't need to be installed on top of an existing DOS install like the previous build that we saw. So very, very much starting to take shape as a recognizable form of Windows 95. So we'll just have a poke around the desktop here. We can see that we have this thing resembling a search bar, I guess, in the taskbar, although it doesn't actually do anything. I'm not quite sure what the plan was for that. And the single unified start menu isn't quite a thing yet. So we have these three buttons here as well. The first one is probably what will end up turning into the start menu, of course. So we've got the shutdown command and the run command and stuff in there. The next one across has find, and then we've got this personal folder and recent folder. Of course, your recent documents and things, and those two debugging tools. I'm guessing this is probably something that they only added for these releases. And the final one is we have help and stuff in here, help and information, I guess you could class this as. So the version number has now been bumped up to version 4, of course, the successor to Windows 3.1, version 4.00.58S. And during the setup process, it doesn't actually prompt for the user and organization as it will do in future versions. So it's always just a license to unknown user and unknown organization. But I guess they just hadn't quite got that working just yet. Again, Windows Chicago branded. And I suppose the other interesting thing about this build is the file cabinet. So if we just go up and run this, this will go on to become File Explorer. And by this point, it is actually looking pretty final. It's looking very Windows 95-like. Double click on the icons and the windows pop up, as you might expect. Now, I have heard that floppy support is completely broken in this build, so you can't load anything from floppy. But apart from that, it is all looking quite functional and quite nice. Interestingly, the kind of the window decoration at the top here in Windows 95, we did have the three buttons in the top right-hand corner with the minimize, maximize, and close. But at this point, Microsoft hadn't actually quite implemented that, so we've still got the Windows 3.1 style controls on here. Oh, and while we are looking at the file cabinet, there is a feature that is supposedly part of 58S that I haven't actually managed to find or enable, called folder tabs. And to be honest with you, this is the reason that I started making this video in the first place, because I really wanted to check this out. Of course, a tabbed interface in the File Explorer isn't something that would come back until Windows 11, the current version of Windows. So something that Microsoft were experimenting with apparently way back in 1993-ish, and then decided to abandon and eventually come back to. And unfortunately, the only reference I can find to this is this solitary screenshot on Twitter. So this is what it looks like, and I was really looking forward to playing with this and showing it off today, but unfortunately I can't find it. So there you go. And finally, if we just close all of this and go to the shutdown option, one quite interesting thing about this specific build at 58S is that we don't have the "it's now safe to turn off your computer" dialog, of course, famously introduced in Windows 95. We just have this essentially wait until disk activity stops before turning off your machine, press Ctrl-Alt-Delete to restart Windows. So we have to make sure that the disk activity has definitely stopped, just like in the good old days, and then we can manually power off the machine. The third Chicago build that I have to show to you in this video is 73F, which is from November 1993. And again, just before we check out the desktop, let's have a look at the installer, because there's some quite interesting stuff that's been added to this. So first up, we have this pre-release agreement and NDA, which of course we have to click through and agree to, and that is a direct result of leaks, essentially. The previous build, 58S, being leaked onto BBSs and the like, back in the day when it was current. And the other thing that Microsoft have added to try to prevent this is this new beta site ID function. So every beta site was issued with its own ID and password, and these two are linked by an algorithm, so basically the same as a serial number. And the algorithm behind these actually took a while to be cracked by the leakers, so it did fend them off for a very short time, but of course, as is inevitable in these things, it did get cracked eventually anyway. But an interesting copy protection measure, I guess. And just a couple of other interesting observations about this installer. There's this new wallpaper with this lovely kind of blue theme to it, and that is very reminiscent of the final Windows 95 release to manufacturing installer, if you are familiar with that. We will see that a bit later on in this video. But some really cool old tech on show here, which I actually really like this wallpaper. It's a bit of a shame that they didn't go with this for the final release, but there you go. And another thing is that, again, courtesy of betawiki.net, someone actually managed to get this to throw an error at one point, which had a reference to Windows 94 in it. So I guess at some point Microsoft were planning to call this release Windows 94. I'm not quite sure, but it is the first appearance of a name other than Chicago, and I thought that was quite noteworthy. So anyway, back to the desktop, and again, it's looking even more Windows 95-like, and we do have a new feature in the taskbar here as well. So if I run something, for example, my computer, and this doesn't quite work coherently yet, but I have managed to get it to do this. Here we go. So if we click on this, we can see that we have the actual running applications in the taskbar now for the very first time ever. Again, something that is going to make its way through to the final release of Windows 95. We also have the briefcase, which is called mybrief.bfc, and this was quite an interesting feature of Windows 95 if you're not familiar with it. So it was a way of synchronizing files across disks. So you could have a briefcase on your desktop and one on, say, a floppy disk, or later on a zip disk or something like that, and you would copy the files into one of the briefcases, and it would essentially make sure that they were synchronized onto another device, very similar to like a modern day Google Drive or iCloud or something like that, but obviously with physical drives rather than the cloud. Very much not a thing back in the early 90s, but that's quite interesting to see the first appearance of this in this build as well. Again, we don't have the unified start menu with the programs list in it just yet, so the programs are in a separate folder here, and we have to browse through to these and check out all of these things. The very first 32-bit application for Windows, I should say as well, is apparently FreeCell, according to betawiki.net. So if we just go through about FreeCell, obviously there's no indication here that this is a native 32-bit application, but just a bit of an interesting historical fact for you. I have no idea how to play FreeCell, so I'm just going to close that. But if we go through to, apologies, this mouse is a bit awkward. Here we go. So that's what I was looking for. So we have Microsoft Write here, which of course should be familiar to those of you who know your Windows 3.1, but we also have WritePad as well. Now, this is the first appearance of the application that will go on to become WordPad. So yeah, it's already here in build 73F, all the way back in November 1993, and it's fully working and very much resembling the final version of WordPad that we will see in Windows 95, just under the name WritePad. And I'm just having a click around on the desktop here, just right-clicking on some things and bringing up some of these dialogues. As you can see, these are very much underway by this point and very much starting to resemble their final Windows 95 RTM counterparts. So we've got the desktop properties and stuff. We've got properties for the C drive. This size thing isn't quite working yet. I'm not quite sure if this is because it's running on a 1 GB compact flash card and it can't quite comprehend that. But we have screensavers and things. We've got some quite interesting, obviously this isn't kind of fully implemented yet, but we've got these rather interesting looking icons. I think they're from Windows 3.1. We've got the monitor settings dialog here with the color palette and the resolution, but I don't have a proper video driver, graphics driver installed for this at this point, so it's not quite fully functional. But yeah, very much starting to take shape as a recognizable Windows 95. And if we just go to shut this down, this will shut down Windows, okay. And there we go. This is also the first appearance of the "you can now safely turn off your computer" prompt, which of course makes its way through to the final version and future versions of Windows as well on machines that don't support ACPI, like this old AT-based machine. But yeah, you can now safely turn off your computer. The next build is 89E from March 1994, so we are still just over a year off from that final release to manufacturing, but I wanted to show this to you just for a couple of reasons. There are some quite interesting things about this build. And again, we'll go straight back to the installer to check out the first one. This marks the first appearance of the Create Emergency Boot floppy option, which is something that will make its way through to the final release, and of course future versions of Windows as well. But other than that, the installer is basically the same as the previous build. And when this did finally boot up for the first time, there were a couple of quite interesting differences. So I got this NT style login prompt, I guess because it's detected the network card in the machine. And then I got this setup start menu prompt, and I had no idea what this was supposed to do. I went through and clicked on some options and things, and I ended up making a complete and utter mess of the start menu, and nothing worked. So I actually went through and reinstalled this for this video just to try and see if it was something that I'd done that broken it. But no, it does seem to be completely broken. So the only other thing I can really show to you about this build, and this is unique to this build as well, so I'm not quite sure what was going on here, but as you can see, we have the click here to begin thing that does slide in from the side. That is something that makes it through to the final release of Windows 95. And the taskbar is at the top of the screen, which is quite an interesting change. And we have the single unified start button with the proper hierarchical menu. We've got programs, documents, and settings, which of course should all look very familiar. All of these options are very familiar to anyone familiar with Windows 95. So again, another quite big milestone in the operating system's development. Unfortunately, nothing actually runs in this install. I can go through and I can click on stuff. MS-DOS prompt, does that work? That's the only one in there with an icon. Nope, that doesn't work. And yeah, I just kind of fire this up and just click around and literally nothing is working. I've tried reinstalling it a few times. I have no idea what the problem is, but to be honest, other than the changes that I've mentioned here, apparently this isn't really all that different to the previous build anyway. So let's move on and check out the next one. And this one, believe it or not, is still a whole year out from the final release to manufacturing of Windows 95. So we've still got all of the Chicago branding on this. I should say this is build 122 from June 1994. And this is the first official beta release. So this was actually released as Beta 1 and was kind of more widely distributed as well, outside of the usual testing circles and things. And it's looking very much like Windows 95, isn't it? If we have a click around here, so we have the click here to begin. The taskbar is back at the bottom where it belongs, and we can click on this and go through the program menu and stuff as well. And yeah, even a year out from release, this is essentially Windows 95, isn't it? We can go through. The My Computer icon is looking a lot more like the final version, and of course it is now called My Computer rather than File Cabinet. And if we just go through and click on under construction, this feature is not implemented yet. So the right click menu on My Computer, that's quite interesting, isn't it? We've got Network Neighborhood, that isn't the final icon. They did change that in the final release, but interesting to see where they were going with that. And if we just properties on here. So yeah, look, we've got the final disk free space display here with the pie chart. It's a well-known pie chart, I suppose. It's one that I'm very familiar with. And we can go through, we can click on everything. We've got taskbar options here. This is quite different from the final release, isn't it? So we can add or remove items to, I see. So we can add or remove items to the start menu using this dialogue, I guess. Is that how that works? Oh, I see, okay. Oh, that's very interesting. That's quite useful, isn't it? That's something that didn't make it through to manufacturing, but there we go. I'll just change that back. What taskbar options do we have? So we have always on top, auto hide. We've got the notification area. So yeah, this is all very much kind of final Windows 95 stuff. And again, like I say, June 94, so still a whole year off from release. And we have Paint. Yep, that's very much looking like the final version of Paint. Microsoft Windows Paint. written by Finnegan O'Malley and Company Incorporated. Username goes here, organization name goes here. Again, not prompted for those during setup. The setup process is the same as the previous build, by the way, which is why I haven't had a look at that. And this lovely under construction wallpaper as well. I very much like that. That's very cool. And one more thing that I should mention, which I did manage to capture during the installation process, is that the first time that you run this, it does actually come up with a version of the Welcome to Windows intro, which is the first appearance of this during this development process. And of course, another thing that makes it through to the final RTM release. And this is the final development build of Windows 95 that I want to show to you in this video. And this is a really big milestone. This is beta 1.4, otherwise known as build 189 from September 1994. And it's the first time we see a fully Windows 95 branded OS. And indeed, the installation process is pretty much identical to the final Windows 95 installer, if you are familiar with that. We still have the pre-release and the NDA agreement at the beginning, of course. And I even used Smart Recovery during the installation process, which I think is actually quite a fairly typical installation experience for these early versions of Windows 95. But that actually worked, and it did resume as it was supposed to partway through the installation process and actually finalize and install a fully working version of Windows 95, or indeed, I'm not quite sure how to refer to this at this point. I guess it is Windows 95. We've got the boot screen, we've got the welcome screen that starts up here at the beginning. Here it is. Here is the kind of the very first version of 95, I guess. So I'm just going to have a bit of a click around the desktop, but to be honest, this is all very familiar looking stuff. And bear in mind, this is September 94, and we still wouldn't release to manufacturing until July 95. So it's still a way off. Of course, loads and loads of bugs and things to iron out, loads of testing to do, but the user interface is pretty much finalized by this point. So we have this Welcome to Windows 95 tour. We've got the Windows tour, tips for Windows 3.1 users. Should we check out the tour? Is this implemented and working? Yes, it is. Okay, so yeah, we've got the starting a program. We've got the old network neighborhood and my computer icons still. They're not quite final. If you just click through, yeah, starting a program, and click the start button now. And there's a little hand-drawn arrow, takes you to the start menu. This is something else I was going to point out about this build as well. We've got this rather funky, stylized start menu here with these icons and things, which I actually really like, although it does kind of look a bit incongruous, I guess. We'll go to accessories. And yeah, start WordPad, a word processing program. Click WordPad now. And of course, we saw WritePad earlier on in this video, which of course was the early rudimentary version of WordPad. And we have the 3 buttons in the top right corner as well now. So now that you know how to open a program, try opening and closing Paint on your own. Well, let's see if we can manage this. So we're going to Programs, Accessories. Still have to click on these rather than hovering. That's quite interesting. But if we're going to Paint, there we go, it's Paint. Except it's not actually working. But there we go. So we'll close this and quit out of this tour because that's not really of much interest, but interesting to see that that is in there and functional. So that's very cool. We've got some tips for Windows 3.1 users. Yeah, this is just going to be a standard help document, I would have thought. So yeah, how to start programs, what happened to program groups, what happened to the file manager, that kind of stuff, as you might expect. So we'll just click through and close this. Can we right click on my computer yet? We can, and we have the version information and everything here, which is wonderful to see. And we have the device manager. Again, as per the final release, the network adapter has been detected. It did detect that during setup and automatically installed the driver as well. That's showing as not working. I'm not quite sure if that's just because I don't have a cable plugged in. We've got the configurations and we got performance. So file system, we've got the virtual memory settings. I mean, this is all looking, for September 94, this is all looking very final, isn't it? So quite interesting stuff. I keep seeing this multi-threaded demo popping up. Let's have a look at that. 32-bit multi-threaded WinBez. Oh, I see. So can we tile these? There we go. Look at that. Wonderful. Showing off the multi-threading capabilities of Windows 95 on this 486 CPU. Go through to properties. Of course, you may have spotted the wallpaper there. That is the iconic Windows 95 setup wallpaper, one of my personal favorites. And look at all of this. I mean, this is all looking very much, yeah, this is all final Windows 95 stuff as well. So quite an interesting build to check out. And I guess, as mentioned, just bug fixes by this point. Yeah, look at all of this. Got the toolbar in there. Oh, it's recognised the CD drive. I think that's the first time we've seen that appear in here. So there we go, build 189 from September 94. We're just going to shut down. We've got the shutdown dialog. Just click on yes. One final thing to show you for build 189. And there we go. You can now safely turn off your computer with Windows 95 branding. Absolutely fascinating to get an insight into the development of arguably one of the most important Windows releases of all time. At least I think so anyway. I mean, let me know down in the comments if you disagree. But if you enjoyed the video, please do remember to give it a little thumbs up. It really does help me out. And if you're not subscribed to the channel and you want to see more of this kind of thing, then please do feel free to do that as well. All that's left from me is to say a big thank you, as always, to my supporters on Patreon, Ko-fi, and indeed my YouTube channel members. They get videos a little bit early and also ad-free. And that's all I got for you for this video. So thank you ever so much for joining me, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one.